Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. What's going on, Stacy?
I'll tell you something, Max. This is not normal. That is according to our first chart here, and it's from Constantin Gurdgiev, who's an economist and an academic, a professor, and he is looking at a chart of the employment participation rate in the United States. This isn't normal, he says. This is a secular disaster. I'll just show you the participation rate going back to 1948, post-World War II, stayed flat at around 60% of the US economy, adults, anybody between say 16 and 65. That included women who were stay-at-home at that time. This is the surge that we saw with all the women coming into the workforce from the late 60s. And now, since 1999-2000, we've had a plunging back to where we began. And we're about at 65%, I think there. Yes, 63% that was averaging right before this economic COVID lockdown. And now it's closer to 60%.
So this isn't the unemployment number. That's a different number. This is a kind of a broader view of the workforce in America. And it shows that the participation rate, that is the people who are working, participating in the economy, is heading down and heading down in a shocking way.
These are the unnecessary, expendable sort of population of the economy. And I think that's why you see all the opioid overdoses, this long-term like absence of any hope. There's no hope for many people in the economy, working age adult population and able-bodied. And we're going to look at the male participation rate in particular soon. But first, if he says, Constantine says that if you think we're getting back to normal, you need to check what normal you have in mind. Here is the unemployment rate going back to the 1948. And, unemployment is obviously cyclical, especially when we used to have business cycles. So when the business cycle was down, unemployment would go up, and then the business cycle would pick back up and people would be employed again. So this covers the long-term unemployed, those who are unemployed for a longer period of time, i.e. the business cycle is not short, business doesn't pick up, economic activity does not pick up. So this is for counting those who are unemployed for 27 weeks or longer. So, these are all the recessions going back to the 1948. And from the global financial crisis of 2008, we've seen a huge spike, a doubling of the normal. It used to be normal to the business cycle to complete. And now we have extreme long-term unemployment that sets in with each financial crisis. And remember, this is the period pre-central bank intervention in the business cycle here. This is post quantitative easing and intervention in the business cycle.
Right. So you're developing in the United States a permanent underclass. So these are people that will, for generations, remain poverty-stricken and no way to escape poverty now, and it's affecting 100 million people or more. And the second thing is that, as you point out, it has to do with the money printing. And speaking as a man, there is a couple of things that need to be satisfied. One, I need to have some kind of meaningful work. Or two, I need to be involved in some kind of existential conflict for the survival of my clan or my country. Mm-hmm. Now, money printing does neither. It simply placates. And so for the average man, this is incredibly insulting, and it stirs up a lot of anger and resentment. And when men begin to realize this is done out of incompetence, and it's done from a place of moral ambiguity by the central planners, it becomes a bigger problem.
You see in the media the elite and the knowledge economy members of the knowledge economy, the winners, as Hillary Clinton called them, versus the losers. I think these are the costs, the cost of money printing, the cost of free money, the cost of preventing a business cycle, the cost of a lot of this started post 1999, 2000. So that is also when we got rid of the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, got rid of Glass-Steagall, and introduced China to the World Trade Organization on favored nation status, and they got to impose tariffs and stuff. So these are the costs. There are costs, and our media, of course, doesn't cover the costs. They don't debate issues. They declare how it is, and so we have to be honest and have this debate. It's like, these are the costs. You're going to have mass unemployment. Partly because, since 1971, we have the reserve currency, and you need a huge deficit in order to finance that, to enable that, because you have to send dollars overseas. We've covered that. You also have China. Obviously, we can't compete with China when they could put huge tariffs on our goods, but we can't do the same according to WTO rules. And the Cantillon effect is like a reserve, the resource curse. So you don't need, why go through the cost and effort of manufacturing when you could just print money and give it to the elite first, and then it might trickle down to the people in the middle of the country. And so it's multi-leveled.
To focus on that moral ambiguity of the central planners and the money printers. And so to keep somebody who's the CEO of a Wall Street bank employed during a downturn in the economy where they would have been fired or their bank would have gone out of business. That would be a normal business cycle. But the money printing has kept these insolvent institutions going and kept their CEOs being paid tens of millions or $100 million or more. So for every CEO of a Wall Street bank that, because of the moral ambivalence of the central planners, the central bank, the Jerome Powell, that means 1 million unemployed men. And so that is a cauldron of angst that is now showing its hand.
Right. And that financialization of the economy that has been enabled partly as well through this nonstop Fed intervention, when you had the Greenspan put introduced in the late 80s through the 90s, and then that's continued with all the central bank put and the rescuing of the financial sector and any listed stock company, essentially. So what that has enabled is the utter financialization of the economy. So you can't really invest in R&D. You can't invest in CapEx, you can't build factories here because shareholders will penalize you, and it doesn't. There's no personal financial incentive for any of the executives to do that when they are more richly rewarded through stock options and things like that, of gaming the system and stock buybacks. So, there's a huge myriad of things that are causing it. There's no one issue that's causing it. But in terms of the male participation in the economy, you see what Constantin Gurdgiev calls no hope economics. And that is quite remarkable, going back to 1948, when we had over 85% of adult able-bodied men working, versus now we're down to about just over 65%. That's kind of the heart of what you're seeing across America in terms of MAGA and all these conflict and the the hysteria in the mainstream media about there's almost a projection of guilt about this situation, the hopeless situation, and the huge deaths of despair that you've seen as mortality rates increase, and mostly due to this situation here of people unemployed. You've had that with every empire and many times throughout history, where there's mass unemployment among men, and it does lead to domestic strife and instability. You saw that in Rome a few times. You saw that led to bread and circuses because there were so many unemployed men. You saw that in ancient China, and that was the emergence of the monks having to defend themselves, the Shaolin monks, and learn kung fu and all that sort of stuff. So, this is a constant throughout history. Of course, Weimar Germany, and where that led. So it can be, I think you see it playing out on a different scale in a modern way.
Right. So the central planners and the central banks that elected to avoid and to ignore the business cycle and the tenets of competition and the tenets of capitalism.
Yes.
Those two things have been snuffed out through money printing. Had they been in play, we would have had bank failures and corporate failures and the emergence of competition and new companies, new banks, new competitive industries, which would have employed a lot of men. But because of the effects, the euthanizing effects of money printing, these men are now been cast aside. And this is not a problem that you can solve by printing more money. And so when you essentially make a swap, you're swapping out a productive economy that's competitive for a docile economy that's becoming more and more mired in self-doubt and violence, to be quite frank. I mean, that's what the central bank, when the central bank will claim that this is a victimless crime when they print money, and yet we don't see that on the ground. We see a lot of violence on the ground, and that goes directly to the Fed's door. They have responsibility for that.
Well, we certainly see an increase in potential protests happening, and we do see deaths of despair increasing. Now, the numbers for women, of course, are very relatively good. They've been good up until just recently. So from 1948, obviously, when they were mostly housewives and not participating in the economy, we saw it surge up to about late 1990s. Again, the period when we saw WTO, China, and all the Glass-Steagall repeal and the introduction of the Commodities Futures Modernization Act. Since this happened, we've seen the economy get lighter and lighter. And this is part of the problem. And whether or not we could ever really go back to normal is because the economy is so light. It's like the likes of Facebook and Twitter and big tech companies like that. They don't need as many workers as Ford and GM and all the big auto needed. However, like, we still need to talk about it and discuss it and address it, and how do we deal with the consequences, because there are side effects to that and nobody's discussed that. And so I do wonder, like, a lot of this is due to the fact that our tax structure and the structure of compensation for CEOs in terms of exporting jobs to China. So how are they responding? It seems like the elite, this very same elite that caused the situation, including Joe Biden, who was there at the time, that it's like Asia pivot and let's start a conflict with China instead of just changing the tax structure.
Wow. It's all going pear-shaped. Hey, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, much more coming your way. Hi, welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Alasdair Macleod of Gold Money. Alasdair, welcome back.
My pleasure, Max.
All right, so just to encapsulate what we said in our previous segment, the inflation-deflation debate makes the most sense if you put it under the rubric of there's a neo-feudal tendency by the central planners to create catastrophes and grab all the cash. Is that a fair statement? And then we can move on.
I think it's probably a little simplistic, but basically we're not getting any richer while they print money. It's as simple as that.
All right, let's move on to some geopolitical areas here. The extraordinary escalation of tensions between the U.S. and China. Biden has ratcheted up even more than Trump. Is this the inevitable Thucydides trap conflict history says usually happens, Alasdair?
Yes, the answer is yes. I mean, basically, the Thucydides trap is, this goes back to the Peloponnesian War. I mean, the idea is that you get a new kid on the block which threatens the supremacy of the existing rulers, if you like, in the area, then you're going to have a war. And we are moving in that direction. And this is actually quite concerning. And the developments in the Ukraine, I think, quite clearly show that this problem is heating up again. I mean, the one thing about President Trump is he didn't start any wars. I mean, it looks to me as if now that Trump is gone, we might be getting back to that rather sorry state where we create wars and people get displaced as part of the very, very big game.
War appears to be a Ponzi scheme. The U.S. has got these military bases all over the world, and they have an enormous military budget, 10 times greater than all the other major economies in the world combined, right? But that's a Ponzi scheme. They do it because, like the old joke, the guy goes to the doctor and says, Doc, my brother thinks he's a chicken, and he says, here, have him take these pills. And the guy says, no, we need the eggs, right? So they've got themselves into this Ponzi scheme of warfare, but that's all it is, right? Because there's the existential threat is not there, correct?
Yeah, it's all about control. I mean, we've known for really since the Second World War that America has tried to retain control over the rest of the world. And in the early days, it was obviously against Russia and China, those communist states, and particularly Russia. I mean, I was brought up in Africa and I saw the money coming in from Russia and coming in from America. He who bribed most basically bought the politicians, and the politicians just pocketed the lot. It's an extension of that game. It's still continuing today. And I just don't see that the security system and the defense industry in America has ever wanted to adapt from those days. It is still continuing to pursue those sort of objectives. And this is sad. I mean, the fact is that America is now losing its hegemonic status around the world. And America doesn't like it. I mean, certainly the intelligence services don't like it, but it is a fact. I mean, already we've got the European Union, which is drifting away from America now that Britain is out of it. You're having a hell of a scrap over this Nord Stream pipeline issue, bypassing the Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are going to be losing on, not getting the transit fees and all the rest of it. The other thing, of course, is that the European Union is on the other end of the Silk Road, the overland Silk Road, and already they are very much tied in with trade along that road, and particularly into China at the other end of the railway. So the idea that America still, through NATO, controls the EU, I think is very, very questionable. And as far as the EU is concerned, I think that they are more interested in doing business with their neighbors to the east than they are with continuing with America telling them what to do.
Right. Everyone remembers the Cold War, and people made mistakes. And it seems though in the 21st century, all the other countries are willing to forgive and forget. You don't see China or Russia complaining about America's overthrow or coup of 50 countries since World War II all over Latin America and around the world, right? So there seems to be maybe a time for America to grow up a little bit. But, you make an interesting point about Europe drifting now east. I've been saying this for a couple of years, curious what you think. We could see Germany join up with Russia, really, going forward. And that would really change the map, wouldn't it, Alasdair?
Absolutely. And this fascinating situation, because if you look at the European Union, that actually is a system that is falling apart. The only thing that's keeping it together is the ECB and the way it prints money to finance governments and the way it manages the euro. That is the only thing keeping the European Union together. Now, at some stage, I think that's going to collapse. Now, what then happens is that Germany is freed of its obligations to all the pigs, if you like, in France and so on and so forth. A seismic shock, sure. But then Germany will have to reevaluate what her role is in Europe. And I think that we've got the makings of a new Hanseatic League, if you like, with trade with Germany there, in sort of a pivot in the middle. You've got Russia on the eastern flank, and you've got Britain on the western flank. And I can see that developing and replacing the EU. And how long will it take? I mean, I think the next financial crisis will probably be the EU's last. And if I'm right in that, then it could be a matter of within a year. I just don't see the EU managing to continue on its current course for terribly long. So we're talking about events which actually could happen fairly soon.
You have been saying for years something that Gerald Celente, who's a guest on the show often, warned 10 years ago, as you have. He put it that currency war leads to trade war, leads to hot war. There's something, a theme you've been talking about. Yeah. It sounds like we're at the stage now where we're tiptoeing into the hot war phase, Alasdair.
Yeah, we're moving towards it, but and the problem is that mistakes are made. I mean, you made that point a little earlier, and this is concerning because I just think that the Ukrainian situation could be one of those mistakes. I have no doubt at all that the Russians are going to come in from the east. They're going to protect what they see as the Russian-speaking people in the east of the Ukraine. And the Americans are absolutely committed, and particularly with Biden and his relationship with the Ukraine, they are committed to try and protect the Ukraine. So this is not a good thing. And I think it's going to deteriorate actually quite rapidly.
Right. Well, for an aggressive a country that's being positioned as the aggressor, that is Russia, they sure have a lot of foreign military bases placed all around their country, in particular to the west and now in Ukraine. So it's really the impingement by NATO east that are the hostile actors in this equation. Let's to be frank, to give it historical accuracy, and all countries have a right to protect themselves. But you're right in that this is escalating, and we've got a lot going on in a way that diplomacy clearly has been thrown out the window. And getting back to America's war Ponzi scheme, if America's not bombing some country, the American economy without doubt collapses. So it thrives on the bombing as part of the empire. Now, is America going through what Great Britain went through when it lost its empire back after World War I? Is America now in the same position where they're basically going to have to give up their empire, Alasdair?
There's a difference in approach. We very deliberately took the view that we could no longer afford to have an empire. And so what we did was we very rapidly tried to educate the locals. I mean, particularly in the African nations like Kenya, where I was brought up. I mean, I went through this because at that time, my father was a politician in Kenya, and my uncle was colonial secretary in London. So, this is very raw stuff. And I can tell you that what we did under Macmillan was we just got the hell out of it. This is not what America is doing. And they're holding themselves, I think, as hostages to fortune, because while we've just been talking about the Ukraine, we ought to also talk about what's going on in the China Sea. There is no doubt in my mind that the right strategy, the Sun Tzu strategy, if you like, of China is quite simply, while your enemy is under pressure elsewhere, that is when you take the opportunity to increase pressure on your enemy. And I think that makes an awful lot of sense in this current context. America will find herself being drawn into the Ukraine and at the same time having to defend her position in the Pacific. This is going to be very, very difficult to do. Our problem is that the people in the defense industry just rub their hands and say, more planes, more missiles, brilliant, this is good business. That, I think, is the underlying problem which we've got to get away from.
Let me ask you this quick question. Would you say, going back the last 5 years, obviously the world's a big place, a lot of countries got different interests, everyone's looking at everybody else, but would you say as a fair statement that the U.S., given the elections of the 2016 and the election of 2020, has been overstating this existential threat from Russia and understating China?
I'm not in a position to make that assessment because I'm sure you will agree with me that all nations basically use propaganda to produce a situation. And we've seen that very, very definitely in the Trump years against China, against China's technology, and the arrest of the finance director of Huawei, who I think is still locked up or not locked up, but under house arrest in Vancouver. I mean, the problem, I think, under President Trump was that he became sort of very inward looking in the sense of make America great again. He wanted to bring all the production back into America, which on a cost basis was, completely nuts. But that was the policy. It was autarkic. It was sort of, going in on themselves, whereas the rest of the world was used to an America which was outward going. And I think it was a fundamental change in the whole situation. China, basically, China did the right thing, I think, strategically she didn't really respond to what America did. Just let America get on with it in a sense and try not to respond. But she did make two mistakes, in my view. The first was that when the situation escalated over Hong Kong, she decided to tear up the treaty with Britain. I think that was I can understand why they did it, but I think that's a mistake. I think the other thing is her, if you like, very, very settled view that Taiwan should be and is part of big China. And I think that's going to be a problem that we're going to see beginning to really make itself felt in the next 6 months or so. I mean, we've already got, increased presence in the South China Seas. The Americans are there. The British are we're sending an aircraft carrier there, or one aircraft carrier.
Right.
I
We
mean,
got to wrap it up,
it's
though, in a
ridiculous.
few seconds. It's fascinating. Would love to continue, but we're out of time. Alasdair, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
That was my pleasure, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. We want to thank our guest, Alasdair Macleod. Until next time, bye, y'all.